All right. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Open Wheel FM podcast. My name is Nicholas Clay, and I realized I might have slightly lied to you guys last week. Not intentionally. For some reason, at the end of the episode, I said that this week I would be talking about both the Detroit Grand Prix as well as the Monaco Grand Prix in Formula One. For some reason, it's been a crazy month of May, which is understandable because of how much motorsport has been going on in the open wheel scene. Completely missed the date for Monaco. So don't worry, Monaco is this current week of me filming this, but I was correct on the Detroit Grand Prix, so we will be jumping into that in this week's episode, recapping all of that and some of the insinuating conversations that happened after the race, giving in potentially some of my own opinions about where INDYCAR is at right now, more specifically about the officiating. In addition to this episode, I'm going to be talking and I guess debriefing the comings of Alpine's changes, more specifically their Gucci acquisition for 2027 through 2030. Yeah, 2030. I had to make sure I got that date right. And then as well as the news that Mercedes had pulled out from the Otro Capital acquisition as well, and kind of where that leads the team in a little bit of a limbo phase as they transition into this next, I guess, direction that they're taking with their team in Formula One. And then also we got some news and confirmation about the Active Aero changes, more so them just opting not to put them in during this upcoming week's Monaco Grand Prix. So a lot to dissect, a lot to go over. So I'm going to jump right in to all of that. But before that, if you like what you were listening to on this week's episode of the Open Wheel FM podcast, make sure to give this episode a like, and also make sure that you are following this on your listening platform of choice. I release this on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube, and you'll also probably see some clips about this week's episode on Instagram and TikTok. So make sure that you are staying up to date on that. But without further ado, let's jump into this week's episode. So I hinted at it in that opening segment that there was some news. It was news that we had gotten wind of a couple weeks ago, but it was confirmed earlier this last week that Gucci would be partnering with Alpine as their team's title sponsor, which is, I don't know if it's a full circle moment because you have Flavio, who was the team principal of Benetton, and Benetton is a luxury brand as well, if it all just kind of made sense. But we also know that Luca De Meo, who owns the Alpine team, also owns Gucci. So there was, I wouldn't say too much of an outlandish possibility that this might happen. For the Alpine team as a whole, this is actually pretty big news, I would say, in terms of their positioning in Formula One as a team. Obviously, their bottom line looks a lot better now. The deal, although it hasn't been confirmed of the exact amount, is around the ballpark of about $50 million for 3 years. So you're looking at $150 million opportunity for Alpine to put that towards resources on their end as a team. Obviously, outside of the means of the cost cap that is currently in place in Formula One. But any money is good money for a team that's trying to build the infrastructure necessary to compete against some of the big dogs, right? Like Mercedes and Ferrari and Red Bull. So Alpine as a outfit and a team, this looks pretty good for them. And I think it also says to us as the public viewer watching, onwards to all of this, that Alpine is definitely taking this opportunity to say, look, we're here in Formula One. We are a serious team and we are going to try and compete. Now, last year there was some inklings of uncertainty regarding the Enstone-based team. What is their future outlook going to be within the sport? We know that they decided to opt away from being a works team and moving into a customer team with Mercedes. We also know that they placed dead last, overall last year. And we also know that the 24% stake of Otro Capital opting to sell out its position, there was a lot of things that, was left up in the air. Where was Alpine going to land at the end of all of it? But this confirmation from Gucci definitely gives a little bit more clarity and clarification. Also, I guess I didn't note this too, but Alpine was moving out of WEC and focusing all their endeavors in the motorsport world exclusively on Formula One. So we know that there was some financial decisions that needed to be made to kind of keep the team afloat potentially, and whether or not the actual Renault team that owns majority stake actually felt like they needed to keep competing in Formula One as a team. But I would say I think this Gucci deal definitely kind of cleared that air quite substantially and gives them, I think, a little bit of pedigree within the paddock to say, look, we're legit. And that is always good for a team. Another thing that came through about the Otro Capital deal, and whether or not it would end up being Mercedes to be the team that would come in and purchase a part of that share. It was confirmed through sources through the race that Mercedes had pulled out their initial obligation to buy that 24% stake within their standing of the Alpine team. This is actually pretty significant. We know that Otro Capital, which is the American backed investment empire that is invested in a lot of different avenues of sports and other entertainment ventures, is owned in joint by a lot of different actors, Ryan Reynolds and stuff. They're actually a pretty sizable chunk of the University of Utah. So if you're a college football fan, they've definitely been around the sporting world. And when they went and bought Alpine in 2023 for their percent in the company, it was initially valued at $230 million. They are now asking for it now at the 24%. They're saying it's now worth $720 million. Mercedes said that we do not feel like Alpine as a whole is worth that amount of money to, warrant that valuation. And so they ultimately decided to pull out from that. That valuation of $720 million that Otro Capital is trying to get for the 24% in the company would value the Formula One team at over $3 billion, which is absolutely absurd if you think about the valuations of some of these teams not even 10 years ago being the value that they are today. Even Haas, which is the smallest team on the grid, is valued to be well over $1 billion. So pretty crazy to think how much value these Formula One teams have gotten in such a short period of time. And that jump from $230 million to $720 was over the course of 3 years. So it's going to be really interesting to see who ends up picking up that stake within Alpine for the coming years. We do know that Renault, who has the majority say of those decisions and matters, the team that owns 76%, has said that they are confident that they could find somebody by September to take over that 24% stake in the team. One of the big caveats is that if they can't find someone, then it is up to Otro Capital to have the executive decision on who they decide to sell it to. So before anything can go through until September, it has to be, I guess, passed or confirmed by the majority share, which is the Renault Group. So very interesting stuff. I think as it gets closer and closer to September, we'll probably see more clarity of that. There has been some names that have been tossed around, like Horner, for example. He's been wanting to get into the game of owning a team that he becomes a part of within the Formula One paddock. But even then, those are still uncertain, as we know that BYD, I mean, it's been rumored, and I don't really like to give rumors, but I think this BYD chance to join F1 actually has some legs to stand on. You know, I know that he might potentially be fitted for that, and I think if that were to happen, I do believe that Horner would probably choose to go with BYD just because he would get an even larger share within the operations of that Formula One team if he decides to take that opportunity up. I don't really see him taking Alpine at 24%, you know, as an ownership position at $720 million. That's quite significant, even for him. So regardless, we'll definitely get some more clarity on this, and I don't want to lead too much into speculation on who's going to end up purchasing that, but it was confirmed that Mercedes had pulled out from being the team that potentially came in for that. All right, so transitioning over into IndyCar, we were on the streets of Detroit this past weekend, a track that I think majority of us spectators and people within the paddock, we don't really care too much for the Detroit race. I think it gives us exciting racing in ways that racing shouldn't really be exciting. I think it's one of those tracks that since they moved from Belle Isle into the street, I mean, it's been a thing that drivers have been going to for years now, and it just feels like it's on the grid because Chevy is on the grid. And which is funny because this weekend we did see again on full display that the Honda, I would say the Honda engines as a whole, as a fit, has been significantly better than the Chevy, which at least on the street circuits has looked a little underwhelming. There was some issues that went on before the race with the Chevy engines and the covers on them basically coming off the engine. There was some work that needed to be done on the McLaren cars as well as the Penske cars. So it was definitely not a good look for the Chevrolet team and the General Motors as a whole, especially because Detroit is their hometown and they, you know, wanted to at least put a driver on the podium at the very least, and they weren't even able to do that in the end. Christian Lundgaard had to get 2 different engine changes throughout the weekend, and somehow he was still able to finish in the top 5, which is pretty good. But Pato O'Ward, who was the highest finishing Chevrolet car in P4, ultimately came out and said that there's just a lot that needs to be done and that those Honda engines just seem to fire so well, not just around Detroit, but I guess around a lot of different circuits. It just seems like that Honda is kind of the field of the choice right now, and it's not really going anywhere. Alex Palou, who ultimately proved to be victorious, was able to convert a pole position for himself. This is his 3rd consecutive pole position, the first of his career to have done 3 consecutive pole positions in 3 different races, which is also pretty, let's just say, pretty crazy to think that he did it on 3 different types of tracks. Obviously the IMS road course, and then the Indy 500 oval, and then the streets of Detroit. He's been able to do that, which is honestly really, I think, a pedigree to his ability on the track as a whole. He looked, I wouldn't say looked lights out. I think there was a lot of opportunity specifically from the competitors that also used the Honda engines, the Andretti cars of Kyle Kirkwood and Will Power, surprisingly, to have maybe taken that pole position. Speaking of Will Power, this was by far his best race weekend until, I guess, the end result. But the actual race and the qualifying, he looked a lot better. It's been quite questionable on how he would be performing since he moved fittings over to Andretti earlier this year. He looked pretty solid overall. I would say this was his best race and qualifying of the season, and it's not even close, which hopefully bodes well for him going into the rest of the season. Kyle Kirkwood, who was the race winner last year, looked to be potentially the one that would claim pole position as well. Had an unfortunate lockup on the Fast 6, and that kind of set him into P6 to start the race, which I think he wished he hoped to have gotten a little bit higher as it went forward. The overall race itself, I guess I could kind of explain how it all went down, but really what kind of factored a lot into the actual race, we know that the degradation from the tires, there was going to be a 2-stop at least across the field. We did see some drivers opt mostly on the soft tires to start, and it ultimately came down to whether or not you wanted to run the white hards or wanted to run the yellow slicker softs to end the final stint of your race. So you'd either go red, white, red, or red, white. And it ultimately came down to the fact that the red tires looked really, really good for about 3 laps. And then as soon as the heat kind of got into those tires, we started to see a lot of slipping, especially of the rear ends throughout the track. And that was kind of a factor that played in. The restarts looked very strong for those red tires as well. As you know, there was some cooling going on with the tires, and the restart allowed them to get the jump on it. But really, it was kind of an uncertainty play on who would end up coming out on top, because the major factor that played into this race, and something that was quite controversial, was the caution flags, the yellow, full course yellows that came out throughout the race. There was a bit of controversy that happened at the IMS road course. Very warranted criticism, I would say, as a whole, with Alexander Rossi on the front straight. Basically, his car died out on him, and there wasn't the necessary full course yellow to not only go and retrieve the car, but also safely get the driver out of the car. There was cars driving by him. I listened to the podcast, which kind of gave some more clarity and insight onto what was happening. And, you know, cars going at 218 miles per hour while you're completely stranded on that straight is extremely dangerous, especially out of the corner. And into that position, there was cars that were literally within inches of him as they were fighting down that straight. Just very scary times, you know, scary as a spectator to watch that happen, because it seemed like, oh my gosh, this is obvious. Clearly, it looks like IndyCar had gotten a lot of flack from that, deservingly so, and decided to change their yellow course rules quite aggressively. One of the big things being that the pit lane would be completely closed for future races when this does happen, something that I don't exactly agree with. But also the fact that that there was some instances where the yellow flags were just being completely thrown out willy-nilly for some things that probably didn't necessarily need to be, and what it ended up doing was rewarding those who did pit early to kind of change the outcome of the race in certain situations. We did see that come to fruition with Alex Palou, who fell back to P4 on the first stint of his tires, and ultimately decided to then pit early again before a yellow flag came out for him. So there was a lot of things that kind of went in. They definitely did alter, I would say, the results of the race. But, you could say the same for Kyle Kirkwood, who got caught out by the yellow, and then was able to still find his way back up to P2 because of all of the end of race excitement that happened as the race went on. Kirkwood rolled the dice, and it ultimately didn't really prove to be the strategy that ultimately ended up being prevailing. But I would even say too, though, that even as the race went on and he was in a position to take it to Palou in the last 15 laps of the race on the softer, better tires on the restart, Alex Palou was able to drive his socks off that car and was able to make work with what it was. So I think that it was the skill of Palou to be able to maintain that lead, more so than I would say the missed opportunity that came from the yellow flag itself. But that just kind of comes with racing as a whole. But it ended up being, at the end of the race, Alex Palou claimed victorious yet again in another season where he's just looked dominant on every single track possible. Kyle Kirkwood came in at P2. Graham Rahal had himself an excellent race. This is his third race of the season where he's ended up on the podium. He hasn't done that in quite some time. I believe 2018 or 2020 was the last time that Graham Rahal was able to accomplish a triple-peat of podium results for himself. So he's having himself quite the season. And he actually did so after receiving contact from Kyffin Simpson earlier on in the race. Very good strategy calls around those yellow flags allowed him to get back up into that position in that place. He's looked very good this season as well. Pato O'Ward, as I mentioned, was the highest placing Chevrolet driver of the weekend in P4. Christian Lundgaard, his teammate right behind him, in P5. After having 2 engine failures this weekend, I think that that's a very impressive result for himself. He's had a pretty good May overall for himself, obviously claiming victory at the IMS road course earlier on in the month. Getting a P5 finish, I would say, is pretty good, all things considered, given all the adversity he did face. P6 was Felix Rosenqvist, who this is the best race finish coming off of victory at the Indianapolis 500 for a race winner since Takuma Sato in 2020. He placed P6, Felix Rosenqvist, riding the high through the end of May. He did have a short interview saying that he's definitely looking forward to a little bit of that break to go and see his family and his newborn baby. It was Foster who came in P7, so Louis Foster. The Rahal Lanigan racing team, RLL, continued to look really, really good as they were able to get 2 drivers within the top 10. Louis Foster has continued to impress, I would say, most of the paddock with his ability. I think me as a spectator of the sport, he's looked tremendously good within his second season, coming off of a very good Indy Next season for himself. As time goes on, I can see him doing and continuing to improve and get better. I know that his tire, his qualifying has always been really good. He's starting to show his pace in the race as well. There was an incident with him and Marcus Armstrong that I Definitely think that he should have been penalized for, but that is Detroit. You got to get your elbows out. Because of that, I think that he was able to be rewarded for that. But in a normal race situation, I think it definitely warranted a penalty for sure. But him not getting that, he ultimately claimed P7, so the elbows out tactic worked for himself. It was Marcus Ericsson in P8. Kiffin Simpson, who had that issue with Graham Rahal earlier on, was able to finish P9. And then Joseph Newgarden, who had probably, in my eyes, the most impressive drive of the field, claiming it was up 11 spots. He started on P21 from the start on Sunday. After, basically having a soft cast and, the injury that he suffered during the Indy 500 race, there was some up in the air whether or not Felipe Nasr would be replacing him for the race if he was fit to do so. Ultimately, it was Penske's decision to put Newgarden back into the car for this race. Newgarden said that he could have probably been significantly higher had he qualified a lot better, but all things considered, with his injury and what he was able to do, this looked pretty good for him. So yeah. But ultimately, though, I think that if you had to take away from the headline stories, and there was a lot going on with this, there was the dominance from Honda on Chevy's home turf. It was, I would say, a pretty miserable optical situation that happened in the Chevy family overall. Like I mentioned, the valve situation with the cars, the engine failures just does not look good, as the team will look to see if whether or not they're going to be able to continue to have that optical sense that these Honda engines are just significantly better than the Chevys right now. It just seems like they are able to fire so much better on the road courses as a whole. But also my opinions on the yellow flag situation, because this is kind of the big deal, right? We know that the independent body of IndyCar came through. In my opinion, I think that the overall pit lane being closed for what it is worth, I think it should be open. I don't agree with it being a closed pit under yellow flag situations. I think that it gives way too much emphasis on the penalty being drastically race altering. For someone who stays out, it shouldn't be that your whole strategy is ruined because of a yellow flag, because your opponent pitted early, knowing that, there's going to be a penalty that's going to end up happening. In my opinion, I don't think that that's great race outcome. I think that you should be rewarded for wanting to go long and being able to test that opportunity. And if a yellow flag completely removes the opportunity for you to go long on a set of tires because, you ultimately didn't pit, and the people behind you did pit, it shouldn't be an exorbitant thing where the pit lane's closed, you're unable to pit under the yellow, to kind of, save face instead of falling all the way back down the order for people that did pit just before the yellow came out. It emphasizes a racing environment where the yellow flag does end up impacting the overall spectacle of the race and the result of the race. I do agree that that should not be the case. And also I had some issue with what they were calling these yellow flags on. At the end of the race, there was that tussle that happened where it spun out a couple drivers, but the drivers were able to reclaim and get back on the track. That's definitely not something that warrants a full course yellow. If there is a stalled car on the track and the car cannot get back up, there should be a situation where you throw a caution flag to see if the car really is unable to start, so that drivers know, like, hey, there's a stalled car. We can't just go race pace by a stalled car. But at the same time, there needs to be the procedural done where if the car is able to get back up and going, that it shouldn't cost a full course yellow to, to ultimately have an impact on the race. Barry Wasner was asked in his press conference after the race whether or not the yellow flag changes, and knowing that IndyCar is probably going to be more trigger happy on those yellows because of the criticism that they faced, whether or not he would be changing his strategies moving forward. He didn't say that he wasn't going to, and whether or not that played into the initial discussions that they had before the race on how they were going to pivot and change, how they were going to pit ultimately. It was smart on their end. I give it to them as a team. They've been able to read every situation really, really well as a team, from the driver to the pit, and I've talked about this in my previous episode. But I think that as a whole, they need to go back and evaluate when yellows are thrown out. I think that there needs to be a double yellow or some other situation that kind of slows cars down cautionarily until they're able to then see and diagnose whether or not it is a stopped car and the driver and the car are at risk in the race to warrant that full course, or whether or not the car is able to get back up and going and they're able to continue the race as fourth front. Because sometimes, and no one really wants a yellow flag to completely change the actual race outcome as a whole. If there's like race-altering debris on the track, I understand in that regard it might make sense to, throw a double yellow cautionary, get everyone to slow down, and remove the debris instead of actually having a situation where there is a full course yellow because of that happening. Another incident that did happen that was it was a pretty big collision, was between Power and McLaughlin, who, let's just say it was McLaughlin who shoved Power into the wall. It was a pretty big shove. Neither driver, it was a no incident call from race control. I thought that was a pretty interesting, and obviously Will Power had some words to say after the race, not just about that and Scotty Mac's driving and how he pushed him off, but also the actual hybrid being a huge issue. And that's not the first time that the hybrid system has failed a driver, and a driver has been very critical of it. Alexander Rossi, when he had his issue at the IMS, was very forthright and said that having a hybrid issue in these Indy cars ultimately ends up shutting down basically the whole car. There's no way to remove the use of that hybrid system to continue on with the race. It's basically that your race is completely over. And, there's been a plethora of drivers that have come forth and said that this hybrid system has done a lot more harm in certain instances than good as a whole. Very interesting stuff. I may end up talking about that at another time and place. I think it's a mixed bag situation for IndyCar as a whole. I know that they have their own identity as a spectacle and a sport. Hybrid technology, I don't think, is necessarily a bad form of racing. But when there comes a time where it's actually completely ruining a race, because drivers are not able to turn off or pivot or move during a race because the hybrid system is having an issue, and therefore the car just has to ultimately DNF. I don't think that that's the right way to go about it either. I think that that's something that IndyCar needs to address moving forward for sure. But yeah, I think that's the Detroit race as a whole. It's just one of those races where strategy is significant in the race, maybe almost too much. And the racing can get kind of gritty, and we saw that a lot. And with the decision from IndyCar and race control to be more let's just say, reactive with the yellows. There's definitely a lot of criticism that came from a plethora of drivers this weekend. We'll just have to see where that all goes. So, and then lastly on this week's episode, I wanted to talk about the announcement from the FIA and Formula One to not run Active Aero during the Monaco Grand Prix this upcoming weekend. It was confirmed that Active Aero would not be allowed during the race in Monte Carlo this upcoming weekend. They had confirmed that they would remove all the straight line mode zones from the track, which means that there will be no Active Aero being used on any of the few and short straights that are around the circuit. My initial perception of this was that it makes somewhat of a sense, and at the same time it doesn't. So the FIA came out and said that there needs to be a necessary window of about 3 seconds of a straight in order to be able to actively be able to use this this Active Aero technology in the straight line mode. And Monaco, they said, just doesn't really have that window. They also said that they don't want this kind of technology to be used when the tires are on the limit. So a primary guiding principle for the use of straight line mode is that it's only deployed in areas where the cars are not on the limit of tire grip. And they've deemed that Monaco, as a circuit where traction and braking is so critical, does not meet that requirement. And so they've said that it would negatively affect the stability on the corners of the cars driving around the circuit. And then they also said that that the straight line mode should last longer than 3 seconds. So in order to avoid what they call short bursts that only add to the driver's workload and fail to deliver significant gains. In my opinion, the way that I see this is that if you're going to have this technology in the race series and you're deciding not to run this to me screams one of two things. The first one is that this technology just doesn't really work in all cases, which doesn't really look good on a technology standpoint. I understand that Monaco is a very unique track. It's also a track where harvesting is so significant that it's not even an issue with the energy deployment throughout a lap at all. So really the actual benefit of that hybrid-like feature of the electrification to the powertrains just doesn't actually do anything. And so then it's like, okay, well, if that's null, right, and every driver is basically harvesting equally, they can, obviously use that energy around the same parts of the track, and we kind of just create a system where it's like a giant train of cars and it's very hard to pass, and there's not really an advantage that's ever gained, which is kind of what this whole Active Aero thing was supposed to help with, but they're not actually using it in the race. It just kind of begs the question of whether or not this is actually going to do anything for the race at all. And I'm in my opinion, I don't really think it's going to do squat, to be quite frank. Just because the cars, even though they're lighter, more nimble, Monaco as a track is just very hard to pass on. And this current type of system that they have doesn't yield anything for these cars. I mean, the cars are already going to be significantly harvested, and they're not going to have to worry about losing energy at all. This is not a depleted circuit like we saw in Canada. This is the complete opposite side of the spectrum, where they're going to have so much energy that they're like, what are they going to do with that, right? Because of as many corners that that the track has. I don't think that this is going to give us great racing, and I think the cars are still too big, and there's just not really enough passing opportunity to give for this. And then it also gives the question of like, okay, in qualifying and during single lap chances, right? Like, is that going to ruin qualifying by not being able to have this to be able to shoot and go for that? I think it just further incentivizes that the teams that are really good in cornering, like McLaren, like Ferrari, will probably be better than, Mercedes. Just this weekend alone, I think it's playing more into their hands as it's starting to look that way. Obviously, the story could tell a different story coming into the race weekend. I guess my prediction for what, and maybe some things that we can look for. Alpine as a team, I talked about them earlier on in this episode, being the 5th best team on the grid right now. I would definitely look to see how they perform. I think that this track, with where the direction of the car is, where some of the upgrades have kind of come in, addressing some of those corners as a team, and them obviously running the Mercedes engine, might be a team to look out for as a dark horse. We know that Pierre Gasly has looked really well around here, and Colapinto has been able to find himself some good form as of late. Another thing that might end up surprising us might be the outcome of Aston Martin, right? This track, because we're relying a little bit less on the power unit as a whole, the aerodynamic magnificence that we've been told that the Aston Martin has been able to produce with Adrian Newey's ability to be able to make that happen, might be a car that might be surprisingly able to maybe get points this race. Fernando Alonso has been really good around here, so would be really cool to see maybe Aston Martin get some points. Who knows? We'll just have to wait and see. But with all of that, that is the end of this week's episode of the Open Wheel FM podcast. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope all of that kind of made sense to you. I will be posting this the next week's episode. I'll be filming it next week, kind of going over what happened during the race. This has been a great episode. Make sure that you follow, like this episode, and hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you all so much for watching the Open Wheel FM podcast. My name is Nicholas Clay. Have a good day.